General Richard Hayes sat in his wheelchair, looking out at the stars from the observation deck of Genesis Prime Station. He had been sitting in this chair for 15 long years now. His face showed no emotion anymore because he had learned to hide the pain and sadness that lived inside him every single day. Once upon a time, he had been the greatest military officer in the entire United Earth Defense Force. He had led human armies against the alien race called the Kryn with such brilliant strategy that other generals studied his tactics in military schools. But all that glory had come with a price that was too heavy to bear. The Battle of Europa had ended the war between humans and the Kryn. Everyone celebrated the victory and called Richard a hero. But during that final battle, a Kryn plasma weapon had hit him directly. The blast had severed his spinal cord and left him paralyzed from the waist down. Human medicine had become incredibly advanced over the years. Doctors could regrow organs and cure diseases that would have killed people in the old days. They could fix almost any injury and bring soldiers back from the edge of death, but nerve damage from Kryn plasma weapons was different. The alien energy did not just destroy the tissue, it changed the cells themselves in a way that made them reject every type of healing treatment that doctors tried. The damaged nerves could not remember what they were supposed to be anymore. Richard had spent 15 years in this wheelchair. He had tried every treatment and seen every specialist. They all told him the same thing. The damage was permanent and there was nothing anyone could do about it. So he had stopped hoping and started just existing. He attended military ceremonies where young soldiers saluted him and looked at him with respect mixed with pity. He gave speeches about courage and sacrifice. He smiled for photographs and shook hands with politicians. But inside he felt empty like a shell of the man he used to be. His wife Linda had stayed with him through everything. She never complained and she always told him that she loved him just as much as before. But Richard could see the sadness in her eyes when she looked at him. She tried to hide it, but he knew her too well. Their children had grown up and moved away to live their own lives. They visited sometimes, but the visits became less frequent as the years went by. Richard understood why. It was hard for them to see their father like this. It was hard for him too. The soldiers on Genesis Prime treated him with enormous respect. They called him Sir and General and Hero, but Richard hated those words now. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a museum piece that people came to look at and then forgot about. The younger soldiers had not even been born when the Kryn War happened. To them, Richard was just a story from history class. An old man in a wheelchair who reminded everyone of a war that most people wanted to forget. Richard was 62 years old now. He had accepted that this was how his life would be until he died. He would sit in this chair and watch the stars and remember the days when he could walk and run and feel like a complete person. He had stopped dreaming about walking again years ago because the disappointment hurt too much. Hope was dangerous and Richard had learned to live without it. At night when he could not sleep, he would roll his wheelchair through the empty corridors of Genesis Prime. The station was quieter at night, and he did not have to see the pity in people's eyes or hear them whisper about him when they thought he could not hear. He knew what they said. Poor General Hayes, such a tragedy. He gave everything for humanity. Richard hated being talked about like he was already dead. Linda tried to get him to be more social and spend time with other people. She organized dinners and invited officers to their quarters, but Richard just went through the motions. He smiled and talked and pretended to care about whatever topic was being discussed. But his mind was somewhere else. Always somewhere else. He thought about the battle on Europa and wondered if he could have done something differently. Maybe if he had positioned his forces another way, or made a different tactical choice, he would not have been hit by that plasma blast. Maybe he would still be walking. Maybe he would still feel alive. The doctors told him he was depressed and offered him medications. Richard took them for a while, but they just made him feel numb. He preferred to feel sad rather than feel nothing at all. At least sadness was real. At least it reminded him that he was still human, even if he did not feel whole anymore. Linda worried about him constantly. She tried to talk to him about his feelings, but Richard did not know how to explain the emptiness inside him. How could he tell her that he felt like only half a person? How could he make her understand that every day was a struggle just to find a reason to keep going? The other veterans with similar injuries looked to Richard as an inspiration. They said if General Hayes could handle being paralyzed, then they could handle it too. Richard smiled and encouraged them and told them to stay strong. But inside he thought they were all lying to themselves just like he was. There was no handling it. There was only enduring it day after day after day. Richard had started to think about his legacy. What would people remember about him after he was gone? Would they remember the brilliant general who won the war? Or would they just remember the sad man in the wheelchair? He had done so much in his life, but somehow the wheelchair had become the thing that defined him now. Everything else seemed to fade away until all that was left was this chair and the prison it represented. He looked out at the stars and wondered if this was all there was left for him. Just waiting, just existing, just being a symbol for other people while he slowly disappeared inside himself. Richard Hayes had fought aliens and won impossible battles and saved humanity from destruction. But he could not save himself from this slow, quiet defeat. He had accepted his fate because what else could he do? Hope was for people who still had something to hope for. Richard had nothing left but memories of the man he used to be. Corporal Marcus Webb had been assigned to Genesis Prime Station 6 months ago, and most of the other soldiers joked that he had gotten the worst job in the entire fleet. He worked in the waste reclamation systems, which meant he spent his days making sure the station's sewage and garbage processing worked correctly. It was not glamorous work, and it definitely was not the kind of assignment that led to promotions or medals. But Marcus approached every single task with the same quiet determination that had defined his entire military career. Marcus had grown up in Detroit in a family that struggled to make ends meet. His father had died when Marcus was 12, and his mother worked 2 jobs to support Marcus and his 3 younger siblings. When the economy collapsed right before the Korean War started, things got even harder. Marcus joined the United Earth Defense Force as soon as he turned 18 because the military paid well, and he could send money home to help his family. His mother had cried when he left, but she understood why he had to go. He had seen real combat during the war. Marcus fought on Mars when the Kryn attacked the colonies there, and he had been part of the defense of Titan when the aliens tried to take control of Saturn's moons. He had distinguished himself in engineering operations, and his commanding officers wrote excellent reports about his work. But Marcus never pursued advancement or tried to climb the military ladder. He seemed perfectly content to do his job and help his fellow soldiers and avoid being in the spotlight. Some people thought he lacked ambition, but that was not true. Marcus just had different priorities than most soldiers. Before joining the military, Marcus had been studying biochemistry at university. He had nearly finished his doctorate when his family's financial situation became desperate. His younger brother got sick and needed expensive medical treatment. His sister wanted to go to college, but there was no money. Marcus made the hard choice to leave school and join the military so he could support them. He never complained about it, and he never told anyone about his academic background. It did not seem relevant to fixing waste processors and maintaining environmental systems. The other soldiers on Genesis Prime liked Marcus. He was friendly and helpful, and never acted like he was better than anyone else. When someone had a problem with their equipment, Marcus would usually fix it even if it was not his job. He had a natural talent for understanding how systems worked and finding creative solutions to technical problems. People appreciated that about him. One night, Marcus was working a late shift to repair an environmental processor in one of the less used sections of the station. The processor had been making strange noises, and Marcus wanted to fix it before it became a bigger problem. He was deep in the maintenance corridor with his tools spread out around him when he heard a sound further down the hallway. Marcus picked up his flashlight and went to investigate because that section was supposed to be empty. He found General Richard Hayes sitting in his wheelchair in the dark. The wheelchair's power cell had died and the backup systems had failed to kick in. The general was just sitting there looking frustrated and tired. Marcus had seen the general around the station before but had never actually met him. Everyone knew who General Hayes was, of course. He was a living legend, but Marcus had never had any reason to interact with him. Marcus walked up and asked if the general needed assistance. He did not make a big deal about who he was talking to or act all nervous and formal. He just treated Richard like any other person who needed help. Richard explained about the wheelchair malfunction, and Marcus knelt down beside the chair with his toolkit. He examined the power systems and quickly diagnosed the problem. The older model wheelchairs, like the one Richard used, had a tendency to develop shorts in the secondary power relay. Marcus had learned about similar systems in his engineering training, and the principles were basically the same. He worked efficiently using just his standard toolkit and his intuitive understanding of how the electrical systems functioned. While he worked, Marcus and Richard talked. It started as just small talk, but somehow the conversation became more real and more interesting than either of them expected. Marcus did not treat Richard like a monument or a tragic figure. He did not speak in that careful, respectful way that people used when they talked to the famous general. He just talked to Richard like he was a regular person. Richard found himself actually engaged in the conversation for the first time in years. They talked about the station and about engineering problems and about life in the military. It felt natural and comfortable. When Marcus finished the repair, he stood up and wiped his hands on his uniform. He told Richard that the fix was temporary and that the general should get the wheelchair properly serviced soon. But it would hold for a few weeks. Richard thanked him and asked his name. Marcus introduced himself and said he was glad he could help. Then he gathered his tools and started to walk away. Richard watched him go and felt something strange. He felt curious about this young soldier who had just helped him without any fuss or ceremony. Marcus had not asked for an autograph or a picture. He had not told Richard how much he admired him or thanked him for his service. He had just fixed the wheelchair and had a normal conversation. It was the most human interaction Richard had experienced in a very long time. Over the next few weeks, Richard found himself seeking out Marcus. He would time his movements through the station to coincide with when Marcus was working. He would roll past the areas where Marcus was assigned and stop to talk. At first it was just brief conversations, but they gradually became longer. Richard learned that Marcus was smart and thoughtful and had a fascinating way of looking at problems. Marcus seemed to enjoy the conversations too. He never acted like talking to a famous general was a burden or an obligation. He just seemed to genuinely like spending time with Richard. Linda noticed the change in her husband almost immediately. Richard seemed more alert and more present than he had been in years. He talked about Marcus at dinner and mentioned things they had discussed. Linda was curious about this young soldier who had somehow broken through her husband's emotional walls. She suggested that Richard invite Marcus to dinner at their quarters. Richard hesitated at first because he did not want to make it weird or formal. But finally he extended the invitation. Marcus accepted and came to dinner one evening. He brought a bottle of wine that he said his mother had sent him, and he helped Linda set the table. Over the meal, the three of them talked and laughed, and it felt like family. Marcus told stories about growing up in Detroit and about his siblings. Linda talked about her work and about their children. Richard found himself relaxing in a way he had forgotten was possible. By the end of the evening, he realized that Marcus had become important to him. This chance meeting in a dark corridor had opened a door that Richard thought was closed forever. The friendship between Richard and Marcus grew stronger over the following weeks. Richard found himself looking forward to their conversations and actively seeking out opportunities to spend time with Marcus. He would roll through the station's corridors during Marcus's work shifts, and they would talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes they discussed technical problems Marcus was solving. Other times they talked about books or history or what they missed about Earth. The conversations always felt easy and natural, like they had known each other for years instead of weeks. Linda watched the transformation in her husband with a mixture of joy and wonder. For 15 years she had watched Richard slowly disappear inside himself. The vibrant, passionate man she had married had been replaced by someone who just went through the motions of living without really being present. But now something had changed. Richard was engaged again. He was interested in things. He was actually living instead of just existing. And it was all because of this young corporal who treated her husband like a friend instead of like a symbol. Linda made sure to include Marcus in their lives as much as possible. She invited him to dinners regularly, and Marcus always came. He never acted like spending time with a general and his wife was some kind of duty or obligation. He genuinely seemed to enjoy being with them. He talked to Linda about cooking because she loved to cook, and he asked her for advice about recipes he could make in his small quarters. He listened when Richard talked about military history and asked intelligent questions that showed he was really paying attention. One evening after a particularly good dinner, the conversation turned to medical technology. Richard was explaining the various treatments he had tried over the years for his paralysis. He described how the crin plasma had damaged his spinal cord and how every attempt at regeneration therapy had failed. Marcus listened carefully, asking occasional questions to better understand the technical details. Richard explained that the problem with plasma nerve damage was that the alien energy did not just destroy the neurons, It created a kind of scar tissue at the quantum level that prevented any regrowth. The cells could no longer recognize their own blueprint, so they could not rebuild themselves properly. Every regeneration attempt would start but then fail, because the cellular machinery did not know what it was supposed to create. Marcus was quiet for a long moment after Richard finished explaining. His expression was thoughtful and intense, like he was working through a complicated problem in his head. Finally, he spoke up and asked if the medical researchers had tried introducing a substrate pattern. Richard looked at him confused and asked what he meant by that. Marcus leaned forward, getting more animated as he tried to explain his idea. In biochemistry, when you had cells that could not recognize their template, sometimes you could give them a different template to follow temporarily. Something that bridged the gap between what was broken and what needed to be rebuilt. It was like giving someone a map when they had forgotten their destination. The CRIN plasma created quantum interference, right? So what if instead of trying to regenerate through the interference, you used the interference itself as a temporary scaffold? Richard just stared at him. In 15 years, he had consulted with the best medical minds in human space. He had been to the top research hospitals and seen the most advanced specialists. None of them had ever suggested anything remotely like what Marcus was describing. Richard asked Marcus if he had studied CRIN plasma effects. Marcus shook his head and said no, he had just been thinking about Richard's situation. He explained that the biology of nerve regeneration was not that different from system repair in some ways. You bypassed what was broken by creating a temporary bridge around it. Then Marcus suddenly looked uncertain, like he had just realized he might be speaking out of turn. He apologized and said he was probably wrong anyway. The doctors would have thought of this approach if it was actually possible. But Richard was already accessing his neural interface and pulling up his complete medical files. He told Marcus that he wanted him to look at all the files and all the medical records, take as much time as needed. Marcus protested and said he was not a doctor and was not qualified to analyze medical data, but Richard insisted. He said that Marcus might not be a doctor, but he was clearly a scientist. And sometimes the solution to an impossible problem required someone who did not know it was impossible. Someone who could look at the situation with fresh eyes and without all the assumptions that experts brought to the table. Marcus looked uncomfortable, but he agreed to review the files. Richard sent everything to Marcus's personal datapad. 15 years' worth of medical records and test results and research papers about plasma nerve damage. Linda watched the exchange with cautious hope. She had seen her husband get his hopes up before, only to have them crushed when a new treatment failed. She did not want to watch that happen again. After Marcus left that night, she gently warned Richard not to believe too much. She said she could not watch him break again if this did not lead anywhere. Richard understood her concern, but he could not help feeling excited. Marcus had given him something precious, not a guarantee of a cure, but something almost as valuable: hope and intellectual engagement, a reason to think about the future. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks completely absorbed in Richard's medical files. He worked during all his off-duty hours, sacrificing sleep and social time to dive deep into the problem. He read every research paper published about CRIN plasma injuries. He studied neural regeneration and quantum biology and cellular repair mechanisms. His small quarters became filled with holographic displays showing molecular structures and nerve pathways. His fellow soldiers noticed that Marcus seemed distracted and tired, but he would not explain what he was working on. Richard found himself energized by Marcus's dedication. He felt a sense of purpose that he thought he had lost forever. Even if Marcus could not find a solution, the fact that someone cared enough to try meant everything to Richard. Linda saw the change in her husband and started to allow herself to hope as well. Maybe this young man really could see something that all the experts had missed. Marcus made dozens of false starts and dead ends. Many times he thought he had found something only to realize it would not work. But he kept going because he had promised to try and because he genuinely wanted to help Richard. The general had become his friend and Marcus cared about him. More than that, Marcus had started to believe that maybe there really was a solution that everyone had overlooked. The more he studied the problem, the more convinced he became that his initial intuition was correct. The quantum interference pattern created by the plasma could be used as a bridge instead of being an obstacle. Finally, after 3 weeks, Marcus came to Richard with his findings. He brought a detailed presentation that he had spent hours preparing. He was nervous because he knew that what he was about to propose went against everything the medical establishment believed about plasma nerve injuries. but he also believed his theory was sound and that it deserved to be heard. Richard and Linda gathered in their quarters to listen to what Marcus had discovered. The young soldier took a deep breath and began to explain his theory that might just change everything. Marcus stood in Richard and Linda's quarters with his datapad in hand and holographic displays floating in the air around him. His hands were shaking slightly because he knew how important this moment was. He had worked for 3 straight weeks on this theory, and he believed it could work, but he was also terrified that he was wrong and that he would crush Richard's hope with a foolish idea from someone who was not even a real doctor. He began by displaying holographic models of neural tissue showing the complex structure of nerve cells and their connections. Marcus explained that he had spent the past week studying everything about Richard's injury and about CRIN plasma effects in general. The medical community had been right about the basic problem. The plasma created what Marcus was calling quantum echo scars. The normal cellular repair mechanisms kept trying to rebuild the damaged nerves, but the quantum interference made every single attempt fail. It was exactly like trying to tune a radio to a station that was being jammed by a powerful signal. Richard nodded because he had heard all this before from dozens of doctors over the years. Marcus saw the slight disappointment in Richard's face and quickly continued. He said yes, the doctors understood the problem, but what they had been trying to do was eliminate the interference. That approach had never worked because the interference was too stable and too deeply embedded in the damaged tissue. You could not remove it without destroying what little healthy nerve tissue remained. But Marcus's idea was completely different. Instead of fighting the interference, what if they used it? He expanded the hologram to show a complex molecular structure that he had designed. Marcus explained that he had created a theoretical compound, a synthetic protein scaffold that would actually resonate with the quantum interference pattern. It would not remove the scarring, and it would not eliminate the interference. Instead, it would give the neurons a temporary pathway to grow along. The interference itself would become a guide rail that the nerves could follow. Richard leaned forward in his wheelchair, studying the holographic model with intense focus. His military mind was good at understanding complex systems and strategies, even if he did not grasp all the technical biochemistry details. He could follow Marcus's logic and see how the pieces fit together. He asked Marcus if this would actually work. Could this theoretical compound really do what Marcus was describing? Marcus took a deep breath and said that theoretically, yes. The mathematics was solid, and the computer simulations he had run showed promising results. The synthetic protein scaffold should be able to create a bridge across the quantum echo scars. The neurons would be able to follow this bridge and reconnect across the damaged section of the spinal cord. But Marcus was quick to add that he was not qualified to do anything with this theory. This needed real researchers with proper resources and authority. It needed people with medical degrees and access to advanced laboratories. Richard felt a fire ignite in his chest. It was a feeling he thought had died 15 years ago. This young soldier who fixed waste processors had potentially just solved a problem that had stumped the best medical minds in human space. Marcus had approached the injury not as an incurable tragedy, but as an engineering problem that needed a creative solution. Richard looked at Linda and saw tears in her eyes. She was thinking the same thing he was. This might actually work. Richard told Marcus that they were taking this theory to the medical command immediately. They would get Marcus the resources and the researchers he needed. Marcus looked nervous and said that he was just a corporal in waste reclamation. The medical establishment was not going to listen to him. Richard smiled grimly and said they would listen if he was standing beside Marcus, or sitting as the case might be. He still had some influence left even if he was confined to a wheelchair. Over the next few days, Richard used every connection he had to arrange a meeting with the Defense Force Medical Research Division. He called in favors and leveraged his reputation as a war hero. He made it clear that this was important and that he needed to be heard. Finally, the meeting was scheduled with Dr. Helen Pierce, who was the head of regenerative medicine for the entire Defense Force. She was brilliant and respected, but also known for being extremely skeptical of new ideas. The day of the meeting arrived, and Richard and Marcus traveled to the medical research facility in the station's science section. Marcus was wearing his dress uniform and looked terrified. Richard tried to reassure him, but the truth was Richard felt nervous too. Everything depended on convincing Dr. Pierce to take Marcus's theory seriously. If she dismissed it out of hand, there would be nowhere else to turn. They entered the conference room and found Dr. Pierce waiting with several other senior medical researchers. She was a stern-looking woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people. She greeted Richard with polite respect, but her expression was skeptical when she looked at Marcus. Richard could tell she was wondering why she had been asked to meet with a random corporal about medical research. Richard started by thanking Dr. Pierce for taking the time to meet with them. Then he turned the presentation over to Marcus. The young soldier took a deep breath and began explaining his theory. He displayed his holographic models and walked through the mathematics and the computer simulations he had run. Marcus was nervous, but his passion for the subject came through. He genuinely believed this could work, and that conviction was evident in every word he spoke. Dr. Pierce listened with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. When Marcus finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke, and her words were not encouraging. She said that while Marcus's presentation was interesting, his theory contradicted 15 years of research. The best minds in medical science had explored every possible avenue for treating plasma nerve damage. This idea of using the quantum interference as a scaffold was creative, but it was also overly simplistic. Marcus was not accounting for cellular rejection or immune response or a dozen other factors that would make the treatment fail. Richard felt anger rising in his chest. He understood that Dr. Pierce had to be cautious, but she was dismissing Marcus's work without really considering it. Richard interrupted and asked if the core concept was sound. Dr. Pierce hesitated and admitted that the concept was interesting. But she said it was untested and theoretical. It would take years to develop and test and approve such a treatment, and there was no guarantee it would work. Richard asked how long it would take to run a computer simulation of the compound's interaction with plasma-damaged tissue. Dr. Pierce frowned and said with their advanced systems a few weeks. But she could not justify allocating research resources based on the amateur theory of an unqualified soldier. The words hung in the air like an insult. Marcus looked down at the table, clearly hurt by the dismissal. Richard felt something break inside him. 15 years of frustration and disappointment and watching people give up on him came pouring out. He said that if Dr. Pierce would not allocate resources based on Marcus's theory, then she should allocate them based on his request. The request of a general who had given everything to the defense force and was now asking for one chance at a life beyond his wheelchair. One chance to see if a brilliant young soldier had found the solution that everyone else had missed. The raw emotion in Richard's voice silenced the entire room. Dr. Pierce stared at him, and for the first time her expression softened slightly. She looked at Marcus again and seemed to really see him instead of just dismissing him. Finally, she spoke and said she would authorize one simulation. If the computer models showed promise, they would consider moving forward. But she was not making any promises. It was a small victory, but Richard had learned long ago that wars were won through small victories that added up over time. The weeks following the meeting with Dr. Pierce were some of the longest of Richard's life. The medical research team had taken Marcus's theoretical compound and entered it into their advanced computer simulation systems. These systems could model molecular interactions and cellular responses with incredible accuracy. They could predict how a drug or treatment would behave in living tissue without actually testing it on animals or people. But the simulations took time, and Richard found himself checking his messages every hour, hoping for news. Marcus had been allowed limited access to the research facility to consult with the team running the simulations. He spent every free moment there answering questions and helping the researchers understand his theory. Some of the younger scientists were excited about Marcus's approach and wanted to explore it further, but the senior researchers remained skeptical. They had spent years studying plasma nerve damage, and they did not like the idea that a corporal with no medical degree might have found a solution they had missed. Richard used this time to rally support for Marcus's project. He reached out to every contact he had in the military and in the medical community. He called in favors from people who owed him, and he appealed to the sense of duty in others. He talked to injured veterans who were suffering from the same type of nerve damage and asked them to write letters to the Medical Research Division, requesting that Marcus's treatment be given a fair chance. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of veterans added their voices to Richard's request. Linda watched her husband work with a mixture of pride and worry. She was proud to see him engaged and fighting for something again. But she was terrified of what would happen if the simulations showed that Marcus's theory did not work. Richard had invested so much hope in this idea, If it failed, Linda feared it would break him worse than the original injury had. She tried to prepare herself for both possibilities, but found it impossible to guard her heart against hope. Marcus spent his nights reading more research papers and refining his calculations. He had access to data that he had never seen before, and it allowed him to improve his theoretical compound. He made small adjustments to the molecular structure to account for factors he had not originally considered. The professional researchers were impressed by how quickly Marcus learned and adapted. Even Dr. Pierce had to admit that the young soldier had a natural gift for this kind of work. 1 month after the initial meeting, Dr. Pierce called Richard and Marcus back to the research facility. Richard's heart pounded as he wheeled himself into the conference room. Marcus walked beside him, looking pale and nervous. They had no idea what the simulation results would show. Dr. Pierce's face was unreadable as she gestured for them to sit. The room felt heavy with tension. Dr. Pierce began by saying that she owed them both an apology. When they had first come to her with Marcus's theory, she had dismissed it too quickly. She had let her own preconceptions and her frustration with years of failed research cloud her judgment. Then she displayed the simulation results on the large holographic screen, and Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. The numbers were incredible. Marcus's theoretical compound showed a 73% probability of successful nerve bridge formation. The cellular rejection risk was minimal. The immune response was within acceptable parameters. This was the most promising breakthrough in plasma injury treatment that anyone had ever seen. Richard felt tears streaming down his face, and he did not care who saw them. 15 years of waiting and hoping and being disappointed had led to this moment. Marcus looked stunned, like he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Dr. Pierce continued explaining that they wanted to move forward immediately, with synthesis of the compound and animal testing. If those tests confirmed the simulation results, they could begin human trials within 6 months. She looked directly at Richard and asked if he would be willing to be the first human subject. Richard did not hesitate for even a second. He said yes, he was absolutely willing. Dr. Pierce warned him about the risks. This was experimental treatment and there were no guarantees. The animal tests might reveal problems that the simulations did not predict. The treatment could fail completely. It could even make his condition worse. But Richard had made his decision. He had lived 15 years without hope, and he was not going to let fear stop him now. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus was granted a temporary reassignment from waste reclamation to the medical research division. His unique understanding of the treatment made him essential to the development process. The researchers synthesized the compound that Marcus had designed and began testing it on laboratory animals with induced nerve damage similar to what Richard had. The results were even better than the simulations had predicted. The animals showed remarkable recovery of nerve function with minimal side effects. Richard underwent extensive medical evaluation to confirm he was a suitable candidate for human trials. At 63 years old, he was older than the ideal test subject. But aside from his paralysis, his health was excellent. He exercised regularly using his upper body, and he had always taken care of himself. The medical team agreed that he was fit enough for the trial. Dr. Pierce continued to warn him about risks, but Richard had stopped listening to the warnings. He was going to do this no matter what anyone said. News of the potential treatment spread through the military community. Other veterans with plasma nerve damage began contacting the research facility, asking to be included in the trials. Richard's story had given hope to thousands of people who had given up on ever walking again. The pressure on Dr. Pierce and her team was enormous. Everyone wanted this treatment to work not just for Richard, but for all the injured soldiers who had sacrificed so much. Marcus felt the weight of all these expectations pressing down on him. He had started this project just trying to help one friend. Now the hopes of thousands of people rested on whether his theory actually worked in a real human body. He worked even harder, pushing himself to exhaustion to make sure every detail was perfect. Richard noticed Marcus's stress and tried to reassure him. He told Marcus that no matter what happened, he had already accomplished something amazing. He had given Richard hope and purpose again. That alone was a gift beyond measure. The day finally arrived when the medical team was ready to begin the human trial. Richard had been prepared both physically and mentally for the procedure. Linda held his hand the night before, looking at him with eyes full of love and fear. She told him that she loved him exactly as he was and that if the treatment did not work, it would not change anything between them. Richard kissed her and promised that no matter what happened tomorrow, they would face it together. Then he closed his eyes and tried to sleep but found it impossible. His mind raced with possibilities both wonderful and terrifying. In a few hours he would find out if Marcus's brilliant theory could actually give him back what he had lost 15 years ago. The morning of the procedure, Richard woke before dawn feeling a strange mixture of terror and excitement. Linda was already awake, sitting in the chair beside their bed, watching him with worried eyes. She had barely slept and Richard could see the exhaustion on her face. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. They did not need words to communicate what they were both feeling. This was the biggest risk they had taken since the injury 15 years ago. Everything could change today or nothing could change. There was no way to know until it was over. The medical facility had prepared a special surgical suite for the procedure. Richard was wheeled in by Marcus, who had insisted on being there for every step of the process. Dr. Pierce and her team were already prepared, wearing their surgical gear and checking the equipment one final time. The compound that Marcus had designed sat in a specialized containment unit. It looked unremarkable, just a clear liquid in a sealed vial. But that liquid represented months of work and the hopes of thousands of people. The procedure itself was surprisingly simple, considering how revolutionary it was. Richard would be under local anesthesia, so he would be awake but would not feel any pain. Dr. Pierce explained that they needed him conscious so they could monitor his responses during the injection process. The compound would be introduced directly into his spinal column through a series of very precise injections. The quantum bridge proteins would then need approximately 3 weeks to establish their scaffolding across the damaged area. During that time, Richard's own neural tissue would attempt to follow the new pathways and reconnect. Richard nodded that he understood and gave his final consent for the procedure to begin. Linda kissed his forehead and whispered that she loved him. Marcus squeezed his shoulder and told him to stay strong. Then the medical team went to work. Richard felt the prick of needles as they administered the local anesthesia. His lower back went numb, which was strange because he had not felt anything there in 15 years anyway. Then Dr. Pierce positioned the specialized injection equipment and began the careful process of introducing the compound. Richard watched the holographic displays showing where each injection was going. He could see his damaged spinal cord on the screen with all its scars and disrupted pathways. He watched as the compound spread through the tissue, seeking out the quantum interference patterns. The whole procedure took about 2 hours. Richard remained still and calm throughout, even though inside he felt like screaming with impatience. He wanted this to work so badly that it physically hurt. When it was finally finished, Dr. Pierce stepped back and removed her surgical mask. She told Richard that the injections had gone perfectly. The compound was distributing exactly as they had hoped, and the initial cellular response looked good. But now came the hard part, which was waiting. For the next 3 weeks, Richard would need to be monitored constantly. He would undergo daily scans to track the progress of the nerve regrowth, and he would need to be patient, because there were no guarantees about when or if he would start to feel results. Richard was moved to a private medical room where he would stay for the duration of the observation period. Linda moved in with him, refusing to leave his side. Marcus visited every day after his shifts, sometimes staying for hours to keep Richard company. The first week was the hardest because nothing happened. Richard felt no different than he had before the procedure. The medical scans showed minimal change. Doubt began to creep into everyone's minds. Maybe the simulations had been wrong. Maybe the treatment did not work in real human tissue the way it had worked in the lab. Dr. Pierce tried to remain optimistic, but Richard could see the worry in her eyes. Marcus looked devastated, convinced that he had failed, and raised false hope. Richard tried to stay positive, but inside he felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had been so sure this would work. He had let himself believe, and now it seemed like that belief had been foolish. On the 8th night after the procedure, Richard woke suddenly in the darkness of his medical room. Something felt different, but he could not immediately identify what it was. He lay still, trying to understand the sensation. Then it hit him. His left foot. He could feel his left foot. It was not quite pain and not quite an itch, but it was definitely sensation. Real, actual feeling in a part of his body that had been dead for 15 years. Richard's heart began to race. He was afraid to move, worried that if he did anything, the feeling would disappear. He lay there in the dark, focusing all his attention on that one foot. The tingling sensation slowly grew stronger. Then he felt it in his right foot too. Both feet, he could feel both his feet. Richard started to cry, unable to hold back the emotions that overwhelmed him. Linda woke to the sound of his sobbing and immediately thought something was wrong. But when Richard told her what he was feeling, she began crying too. They called for the medical team immediately. Dr. Pierce arrived within minutes, still in her sleep clothes. She ran scans and examined Richard carefully. The holographic displays showed something miraculous. Active nerve regrowth was occurring along the quantum bridge pathways. The neurons were following Marcus's synthetic scaffold exactly as he had theorized. The damaged tissue was rebuilding itself using the quantum interference as a guide. It was working. The treatment was actually working. The news spread through the medical facility like wildfire. Marcus was woken by Dr. Pierce calling him and telling him to get to Richard's room immediately. When Marcus arrived and saw the scans showing active regrowth, he collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed by relief and joy. Richard looked at him and said thank you over and over until the words lost meaning. Marcus just shook his head and said he had only provided the theory. Richard's courage to try it was what made the difference. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard regained sensation throughout his entire lower body. The tingling gave way to normal feeling. He could tell when someone touched his legs. He could feel temperature changes. He could sense pressure and texture. It was like being reborn. Every new sensation was a miracle that made him want to cry with gratitude. The medical team documented everything, creating detailed records of the most successful treatment for plasma nerve damage in history. With sensation came the possibility of movement. Physical therapy became Richard's new mission. He approached it with the same determination he had once brought to military campaigns. He worked with therapists who helped him learn to control muscles that had not functioned in 15 years. It was brutally hard work. 15 years of paralysis meant his muscles had atrophied significantly. He had to rebuild strength from almost nothing. But Richard did not care how hard it was. He would do whatever it took. Marcus was there for every therapy session, encouraging Richard and celebrating every tiny victory. Linda watched her husband work with tears of joy streaming down her face. She was seeing the man she had married coming back to life. The determination and fire that had made Richard such an effective general was now focused on learning to walk again. And everyone who saw him work knew that he would succeed, because failure simply was not an option he would accept. On Yachty 2, day 23 after the initial treatment, Richard stood up from his wheelchair for the first time in 15 years. He needed support from the parallel bars and from Marcus, who stood ready to catch him if he fell. His legs shook with effort, and he could only stand for a few seconds before exhaustion forced him to sit back down. But those few seconds changed everything. Richard Hayes was standing. The broken general was broken no more. The image of General Richard Hayes standing up for the first time in 15 years spread across every media outlet in human space within hours. Someone had recorded the moment on their personal device, and the video went viral immediately. People everywhere watched Richard's legs shake with effort as Marcus supported him on one side and Linda held him on the other. They watched him take one trembling step and then another before exhaustion forced him back into his wheelchair. And they watched the pure joy on his face that made it clear this was the most important victory of his entire life. The media wanted interviews and photographs and statements. Richard agreed to one press conference where he stood at a podium with support braces on his legs and spoke for exactly 5 minutes before sitting back down. He told the reporters that his recovery was the result of brilliant work by Corporal Marcus Webb and the medical research team. He said that thousands of other veterans would soon benefit from this treatment, and he asked that people respect his privacy while he continued his rehabilitation. Then he was wheeled away, leaving the reporters shouting questions at his back. But for Richard, the media attention was completely secondary to the profound personal transformation he was experiencing. Learning to walk again required him to completely relearn movements that most people did without thinking. His brain had to reconnect with muscles and nerves that had been silent for 15 years. Every single step required intense concentration and effort. He fell down constantly. His legs would give out without warning, sending him crashing to the floor. The physical therapist said this was normal and expected, but it was still frustrating and sometimes humiliating. Marcus remained by his side throughout the entire recovery process. Their friendship had deepened into something that felt like family. Richard had begun to think of Marcus as the son he had always wanted to mentor. Marcus looked up to Richard with genuine affection and respect that had nothing to do with the general's fame or military record. They pushed each other to work harder and never give up. When Richard wanted to quit after a particularly bad fall, Marcus would remind him of how far he had come. When Marcus doubted whether his treatment would help other patients, Richard would point out all the proof that it worked. The Defense Force offered Marcus a promotion and a position in the Medical Research Division. Marcus was hesitant at first, feeling like he was not qualified to work with professional scientists. But Richard insisted that Marcus had proven himself beyond any doubt. He had solved a problem that had stumped the best medical minds in human space. He deserved recognition and the opportunity to continue making a difference. Marcus finally accepted the promotion, becoming Lieutenant Marcus Webb and officially joining Dr. Pierce's research team. Richard's physical recovery continued to progress. Within 2 months, he could walk short distances with a cane. Within 4 months, he was walking without any assistance, though he tired easily and still needed the wheelchair for longer distances. His doctors were amazed by his progress. They had expected recovery to take much longer given his age and the length of time he had been paralyzed. But Richard's determination and intense physical therapy regimen had accelerated his healing beyond all predictions. For Richard, the physical recovery was matched by an emotional and spiritual rebirth. He had spent 15 years feeling disconnected from life and just going through the motions. Every day had been a struggle to find meaning in his existence. Now everything was different. Every sensation was precious. The feeling of grass under his bare feet made him want to cry with joy. The ability to embrace Linda while standing and look into her eyes at the same level felt like a miracle. The simple act of climbing stairs was an adventure that thrilled him every time. He discovered new purposes that went beyond just his personal recovery. His experience with disability and recovery gave him unique insight into the struggles that wounded veterans faced every day. He became an advocate for better treatment and support systems. He used his renewed influence to push for changes in how the military cared for injured soldiers. He visited veterans in hospitals and rehabilitation centers, sharing his story and giving them hope. People listened to him now, not just because he was a famous general, but because he understood their pain in a way that few others could. Linda watched her husband's transformation with overwhelming gratitude. She had loved Richard through 15 difficult years, never complaining about the limitations his injury placed on their lives. But she had also mourned the loss of the vibrant, passionate man she had married. Now she had him back. They could go for walks together holding hands. They could dance slowly in their quarters to music they both loved. They could make love again in ways that had been impossible for 15 years. Their relationship felt new and exciting, like they were falling in love all over again. The treatment that Marcus had developed was now being offered to other veterans with plasma nerve damage. The success rate was even higher than the initial simulations had predicted. 1,700 veterans had received the treatment in the first 6 months, and nearly all of them showed significant improvement. Some recovered completely, others regained partial function. A few did not respond to the treatment at all. But overall, the results were extraordinary and represented the greatest breakthrough in military medicine in decades. Marcus found himself becoming famous despite his natural tendency to avoid the spotlight. He was invited to speak at medical conferences and research symposiums. Scientific journals published his papers. Universities offered him faculty positions. But Marcus remained humble and focused on the work rather than the recognition. He was already working on applications of quantum bridge protein technology to other types of nerve damage and degenerative diseases, the same principles that had helped Richard might be able to help people with conditions that had nothing to do with alien plasma weapons. A ceremony was held to honor the medical team and Marcus, specifically for their breakthrough work. Richard insisted on attending and insisted that Marcus stand beside him at the podium. The auditorium was filled with military officers and medical professionals and recovered veterans who owed their mobility to Marcus's innovation. Richard gave a speech that he had written himself, working on every word to make sure it captured what he wanted to say. He told the audience that 15 years ago he had believed his life was effectively over. He had accepted a half-existence of going through the motions without real hope for change. Then he met a young corporal who saw him not as a broken hero or a tragic symbol, but as a person who deserved help. Marcus Webb had not just given him back the ability to walk. He had given him back his future and his sense of purpose. He had shown Richard that no problem was truly insurmountable if you had courage and intelligence and the willingness to try. Richard went on to say that Marcus had now done for thousands of veterans what he had done for one general. The quantum bridge protein treatment had restored hope and function to injured soldiers across human space. But more important than the medical breakthrough itself was what Marcus represented. He showed that brilliant solutions could come from unexpected places, that a corporal working in waste reclamation might see what elite researchers had missed. That compassion combined with intelligence could change the world. Richard's voice broke with emotion as he announced that Marcus was being promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his contributions to medical science and his service to injured veterans. The audience erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes. Marcus looked uncomfortable with all the attention, but Richard could see the pride in his eyes. After the ceremony, people crowded around Marcus wanting to shake his hand and thank him. Richard stood nearby watching with satisfaction. This young man who had helped him in a dark corridor out of simple human decency had become a hero in his own right. And Richard knew that Marcus's greatest contributions were still ahead of him. The quantum bridge protein was just the beginning of what this brilliant mind would accomplish.